Not once upon a time, like in a fairy tale, but on a real night. A real night, just like tonight. A night that was cold outside and warm inside. A night where the air was thick with possibility, where anything might happen, where it felt like you could smell a miracle. On a night like this, something happened that would change the world forever. Our story takes place between here and there, on the way, between the already and the not yet. It takes place on the way in another borrowed holy space, not Bethel, but Bethlehem. And the stars of our story are, well, two nobodies, really, on their way to the middle of nowhere, or was it the center of the universe? And he was middle-aged, with his accumulated mistakes and regrets and some solid successes and aches and pains that kept him up at night. He could have been anybody. You, me. And she was a young woman, fresh-faced, right out of school, with all kinds of nameless longings and vague dreams for how she hoped her life might turn out, how she might be useful to the world. And some things seemed to be going more or less on track, while others were not exactly what she expected. She could have been anybody. You, me. Now they were on their way, and they traveled by donkey. They weren't exactly rich. Donkey was like the ancient day equivalent of flying coach. But they didn't need much more than each other. They were going to be married. And she was pregnant. They had a child on the way. Now, in those days, Caesar Augustus was emperor, or as he liked to call it, president of all the world. And he had mixed approval ratings, but some people worshipped the guy, literally. They thought he was God. And Emperor Augustus thought about retiring. He'd been holding on to power for so long, but when you hold on to something for so long, it becomes harder and harder to let go. And so this was before term limits. And he'd become president so long ago. It had been like 42 years now. And so instead of retiring, he thought he'd count up his people, make a tally of his power, his reach, the way you might count your Christmas presents or your Halloween candy, revel in it. And so he sent a message throughout the land to have people travel to the place of their ancestry, a practice many are still engaging in today around this time of year, traveling long distances in uncomfortable circumstances to return to the land of their forebears. And so Joseph's family was from Bethlehem, which means the house of bread, also known as the city of David, because it's where David, the greatest king of Israel, was born. Well, that was before Rome took over. Rome and their modernization and their changes and the way they sped things up. But there were some people who still moved at a slower pace. Before Rome came in and tried to kill the idea of God, the God of David and Moses, the God of Joseph and Mary, the God revealed in the burning bush and the still small voice. That God stayed alive in the faith of those who continue to live at the slower pace, the pace of faith, which moves one step at a time. And so because Mary and Joseph still moved at that slower pace, and maybe because Mary was moving a little slower these days, it took them a little while to get to Bethlehem. And when they finally got there, Joseph had forgotten to make a reservation. And there was no vacancy, no room at the inn. But they had to rely upon the kindness of strangers. And they did. And the kindness appeared. And there was room for them. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was enough. It was enough. And so there, the two who had been come to Bethlehem to be counted were to become three. One more gift for the emperor's census. And there, I don't know how silent a night it really was, because before any great thing, any new thing is born, there are labor pains. And Mary breathed, and she pushed, and then was born her firstborn child. And they wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a place where animals eat out of. And it was a baby, a real human child with 10 fingers and 10 toes and eyelashes and everything. And it was more than a baby. Because you see, as they had been walking steadily in their faith, Mary and Joseph, they had walked slow enough to listen to the sound of angels in their dreams, which told them that this baby who would be born would be God's own child, a gift, one who would grow up, this Jesus, to save us from ourselves, not just once and for all, but over and over and over again. And then, now that the baby was here, the angels returned, and suddenly they were everywhere, and they were filling the sky, singing, "Glory, glory, glory to God in the highest heavens, and on earth peace and goodwill to all." And it was as terrifying and as wonderful as you can imagine.
Near that place where Mary was nursing Jesus and Joseph was working like mad to try to keep the drafts out, there were shepherds watching their flocks by night. Now, they were a rough around the edges group, these shepherds, not much schooling between them. Some might have even called them hicks. And one of those angels that was flying around came to them and said, "Don't be afraid. I have good news for you and for all the people. All the people, but for you first. A baby was just born right over there in Bethlehem. The one who will save you. The very Lord, in fact." Now I know you who've been going to God all these years with your prayers and your gifts. But now God has come to you as a gift. God has come to you. Come and see. Come and see. This is how you'll know that you have the right baby. He'll be wrapped in plain cloths and lying in a manger. Well, this news was quite unexpected because, the Roman president, the one they call God, he was the richest person on the earth. And whenever he showed up anywhere, He came with hundreds of servants and soldiers and horses. He wore the finest robes of gold and purple, always had weapons. You had to be somebody really important to be able to see him face to face. And now here was a God who was doing the exact opposite. It was like this God's birth was a secret, but a secret only told to the poor, the lowly, the left behind, the nobodies. It was so sneaky, so opposite. It was exactly the kind of thing a real God would do if you stop to think about it. So the shepherds went. They went and they found that baby. They found Jesus, and they crowded into that small and hot, tiny space, and they told Joseph and Mary everything the angels had told them about who Jesus was and what he would do. And there was laughing and singing, and somebody pulled out some sparkling cider, and somebody had some cheese and a little bread to share, and there was more laughter, and a party just bubbled up. But Mary was quiet. She treasured these things and pondered all these words in her heart. And the shepherds, they just couldn't stop staring at that baby, that tiny baby, and thinking about Caesar, who they were supposed to call God. Caesar, with his armies and his servants and his purple robe. But that tiny baby, wearing just a blanket and laying where the donkeys ate, they took the baby's fingers and they put it up to their rough cheek, and they started making those ridiculous cooing noises and funny faces. And they looked at that baby and they said, yes, we believe. If God was going to become a human, this is exactly how God would come. Not with military parades meant to frighten us and show us how small we are, but as a tiny baby to show us how fine we are. Because babies bring out the best in us, all our tenderness. Babies make us want to be our best selves. Babies make us grow up and also turn us into little kids just the same. So the shepherds, they went home, shaking their heads and saying how amazing God is. Because what do you do when you meet God? You go home and you try to live your life a little bit differently. You try to be a grown-up and a kid all at the same time. And you try to live into and live up to that incredible love from the one who loves you more than you have ever been loved before.
The people in the marketplace in downtown Jerusalem knew immediately that these three guys were from out of town. They were dressed differently, they carried themselves differently, they seemed to be important. They weren't sure exactly who they were or what they were, but they knew they weren't of their crowd. And these folks were asking around. They were saying, we've been following the star. We've been following a star. And we've heard the child is going to be born. And then he's going to be king of the Jews. Have you heard anything about that? Can you give me some directions? We're not sure exactly which direction to go next. And they were asking around, and they were asking around, and they were asking around. And of course, you know, when people show up and they start asking questions like that, it gets around. the word gets around. Pretty soon, it got back to the guy who thought he was king of the Jews. It got back to King Herod. He said, they're saying, what? And he called his advisors and his wise people, and he said, no, I seem to remember this story, this prophecy in the Bible about this child that was supposed to be born somewhere near here. Wasn't that right? Wasn't it supposed to be somewhere near here? And they said, yes, you're right. It was supposed to be somewhere near here. Oh, I better check this out. Please go and find these people and bring them to me right now. He was a small man in many ways, but he thought he was powerful. At least he had all the power that the Romans would give him to be king of the Jews. And so his minions went out and they brought the wise men in, and he suddenly became a different person. He said, oh, I've heard you're looking for this child that is a special one. I'm very interested in this. Please, will you go and search him out and then let me know where he is so I can find out what to do about him? So I can go and worship him like everyone else. And so the wise people went on their way following the star, and the star was on the move. And they were after the star. They were following the star. I don't know if the star was moving quickly or slowly. I don't know if they had to jog or whether they could just kind of wander along watching the star, but they kept going until that star stopped. It stopped, you know. It was either the middle of nowhere or it was the center of the whole universe. And there the star stopped over this manger, and the wise people went into this small stable with the whole crowd, you know, by that time, the shepherds and the angels, and they were all there. The wise people were not the first ones to get there. But there in this manger was a child. And these three guys who were, you know, actually pretty serious sorts, they went up to the manger and they looked at this child. Oh. Yeah. The same thing we do whenever we see a child, even these three very serious guys who were looking for a savior, melted at the sight of this small child lying in a manger, in a stable, in the middle of everywhere. And they had brought gifts. They had brought very important gifts. Not practical gifts, but very important gifts. They had brought gold and frankincense and myrrh. Not the sort of gifts that you would just kind of use up and toss away like the gift basket you got yesterday, but gifts you would treasure and you would hold on to and remember. Gifts for a very important sort of person. And actually, pretty valuable gifts, even for this family that seemed to be of lowly estate. And here's the thing. These very important people, who knows how they had achieved, what they had achieved, who they had impressed, but they got down on their knees in front of this child. They got down on their knees in front of this child. Do you understand the symbolism of that? Of course you do. You've been watching Game of Thrones. You know what it means when you bend a knee to someone. This was a very special child. Because they weren't very young, once they had gotten down there, they weren't sure how to get back up. But they did. They kind of struggled. They struggled up. And filled with joy and hope and a sense of possibility, they took all of this in. And before they were returned to their homeland, one of them had a dream. And one of those angels that keeps popping up in these stories said, "Don't go back to Herod and tell them where this child is. Not a good idea." And so they went home by another route.